The sound of the coffee machine filled the silence of the morning, a familiar hum that had become part of my routine. The aroma curled through the air, rich and comforting, yet it failed to ignite anything within me. Across the kitchen, my husband scrolled through his phone, engrossed in something far removed from this moment. "Are you working late again tonight?" I asked, not expecting much of an answer. He nodded, barely glancing up. "Yeah, probably. I have back-to-back meetings." I nodded, forcing a small smile. The same conversation, different day. It wasn't his fault. He was a good man, a reliable husband. But there were moments, like now, when I felt like we were simply two people coexisting rather than a couple. I took a sip of coffee, staring out the kitchen window. That's when I saw him, our neighbor. He was fixing something on his porch, moving with effortless confidence. There was something about him, something that unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite define. Our eyes met just for a second, but it was enough. My stomach tightened and I quickly looked away. I shouldn't have felt anything. But I did. The first real encounter happened later that day. I had stepped outside to water the plants when I heard his voice. "Need a hand with that?" I turned to see him standing near the fence, a smirk playing on his lips. He was close, but not too close. Just close enough for me to feel the weight of his presence. "I think I can manage," I said, though the way my fingers fumbled with the hose betrayed me. "Your husband not around?" His tone was casual, but there was something else beneath it. "He's working late," I replied automatically. He nodded, leaning against the fence. "Must be busy a lot." There was no judgment in his voice, no sympathy. Just an observation. But it hit somewhere deep, somewhere I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. I should have ended the conversation. Instead I lingered. And so did he. That night, as I lay beside my husband in bed, I stared at the ceiling. His steady breathing filled the room, his warmth close yet distant. I closed my eyes, but instead of sleep, my mind replayed the way my neighbor had looked at me, the way his gaze had lingered just a little too long. I told myself it was nothing. Just a harmless moment. But deep down, something inside me knew, this was the beginning of something dangerous. I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting glance. A meaningless exchange. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I lingered outside longer than usual, pretending to fix something in the yard. My husband had already left for work and the house felt too quiet, too empty. I shouldn't have been disappointed when I didn't see him. But I was. I shook my head as if I could physically remove the thought from my mind. This was ridiculous. I had a husband. A good man. But that night, as I got ready for bed, I hesitated before choosing my usual sleepwear. Instead, I pulled out something else. A silk slip I hadn't worn in years. I told myself it was just for me, just a small act of reclaiming something I had lost. Still, when I walked past the mirror, I found myself wondering, would he notice? The next day, fate, or perhaps something more dangerous, gave me exactly what I had been waiting for. I was bringing in groceries when I heard his voice. "Need a hand?" I turned to find him standing in his doorway, watching me with that same easy confidence. "It's fine," I said, but he was already crossing the yard, effortlessly taking the bags from my hands. I should have protested. Instead I let him. Inside, the air felt different with him in my kitchen. He leaned against the counter, looking around like he belonged there. "Your husband not home?" I shook my head. "Meetings." He nodded as if he expected the answer. "He must trust you a lot." The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I laughed, trying to break the tension. "Shouldn't he?" He studied me for a long moment before shrugging. "Guess that depends." The way he said it, like he knew something I didn't, sent a shiver down my spine. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of what I wanted from him. That night I didn't sleep. Not because of guilt, but because of anticipation. I had spent so long convincing myself that my life was enough. That love without passion was still love. But now, for the first time in years, I felt awake. And I wasn't sure I wanted to go back to sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about him. It was becoming unbearable, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Every time I saw him, my heart raced in ways that made no sense. But the truth was, it wasn't just his physical presence that haunted me. It was the way he made me feel, like I was someone else. Someone desired, someone worth noticing. The day he helped me with the groceries, something shifted. The spark was no longer just a passing thought. It was something tangible now, something that was slowly consuming me. I avoided him for a few days, telling myself I was being ridiculous. He was just a neighbor, nothing more. I had a husband. But that evening when I was taking the trash out, I saw him again. This time he didn't say anything at first. He just watched me. "Hey," he finally said, his voice casual, but there was something else there, a kind of unspoken challenge in his eyes. "Hi," I replied, the word coming out softer than I intended. There was an almost imperceptible pause. Then with a shrug he took a few steps closer. "We've been talking a lot lately, but we never really talk, you know?" I nodded, swallowing hard. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but my body seemed to know. He took another step forward, just a little closer. I felt the pull. My heart beat faster. "I guess we don't." He smiled, a slow, confident smile. "What do you think we should do about that?" I knew in that moment that if I said the wrong thing, nothing would ever be the same. Before I could answer, he stepped even closer. His hand brushed against mine, sending a shock of electricity through my body. I was paralyzed. His gaze dropped to my lips, and for a long moment neither of us moved. He didn't need to say anything. The air between us was thick, charged. And then, in the blink of an eye, he kissed me. It wasn't slow. It wasn't gentle. It was a kiss that tore through every ounce of restraint I had left. His lips were firm against mine, his body pressing me into the wall, his hands gripping my waist. I should have pulled away. I should have told him to stop. But instead I let him. Let it happen. I wanted it. I needed it. I felt his warmth spread through me, igniting something I had buried for so long. I had never felt this alive. We broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, our faces inches apart. The moment hung between us, raw and undeniable. "Why did you stop?" he whispered, his voice low, almost teasing. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My head was spinning. My heart was pounding. The guilt was already creeping in, but it felt so far away. It didn't matter right now. "Because I can't," I finally whispered, barely audible, the admission feeling like a confession. He smirked, stepping back. "I think you can." And just like that, the line between right and wrong, between guilt and desire, had been crossed. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the taste of his kiss still lingering on my lips. What had I just done? I felt the weight of it, the shame of betrayal, but there was also something else. Something I couldn't ignore. I had wanted this. Wanted him. And for the first time in a long time I felt wanted in return. But where did that leave me? I had crossed a line, and now I had to live with the consequences. But I wasn't sure I cared anymore. The days that followed felt like a haze, a blur of emotions that I couldn't untangle. Every glance I stole toward him seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken words. The kiss, that moment of reckless abandon, played on a loop in my mind. But the guilt, the sharp edge of it, was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. I tried to pretend like nothing had changed. I went through the motions of my life, interacting with my husband as if the world hadn't shifted. But the truth was, I couldn't get his touch out of my mind. The way his hands had held me. The way his lips had tasted. It felt like an addiction I couldn't shake. I couldn't tell anyone about it. I couldn't tell him either. I was stuck in this strange limbo, caught between my obligations and the wild desire that burned every time I saw him. But it wasn't just the desire that kept me tethered to him. It was the way he made me feel. In the moments we shared, even in the silence, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. I was pulling into the driveway after running some errands when I noticed him standing at the edge of his porch, casually leaning against the railing, watching me. There was no way to pretend I hadn't seen him. I turned off the engine, my heart racing in anticipation, though I couldn't quite name why. "Hey," he called out, his voice low, almost like a dare. "Hi," I replied, my voice unsteady, betraying me in ways I couldn't control. He smiled, that same knowing smile that seemed to reach deep inside me. "You're looking good," he said, his tone carrying more than just a compliment. I didn't respond, unsure of what to say. My chest felt tight, my body betraying me as I stood frozen. He stepped off the porch and walked toward me. He didn't ask, didn't wait for an invitation. He just came closer, his presence overwhelming, magnetic. "Why don't you come over?" he asked, his voice low, as if we were the only two people in the world. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words never came. Instead, I found myself stepping forward. Just a few steps. I hesitated, my mind screaming that I shouldn't, that I had to resist. But the desire, the pull, was too strong. It overwhelmed my thoughts. I knew this was dangerous. But I didn't care. He led me to the side of his house, away from prying eyes. It was a quiet corner of the yard, isolated, private. Just us. He didn't waste time. He took my hand, leading me to where the shadows fell heavy, wrapping us in a cocoon of secrecy. "You've been avoiding me," he murmured, his fingers brushing against mine. "I haven't been avoiding you," I whispered back, even though I knew it wasn't true. He was so close now I could feel the warmth of his body radiating against mine. "I don't believe you," he said softly. "I think you've been wanting this as much as I have." Before I could answer, he kissed me again, this time with purpose. His lips crushed against mine, no hesitation, no question. And for a moment I forgot everything else. The world outside disappeared. There was nothing but him, nothing but the way he made me feel, wanted, needed. A feeling I hadn't had in so long. His hands slid down my back, pulling me closer. I felt the weight of his body press against mine, a sensation that made my heart race and my breath catch in my throat. I could hear the sound of my pulse in my ears, louder than anything else. It was the only thing that mattered. The only thing that made sense. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my body alive with electricity. I stepped back, but I couldn't look at him. "Not yet. I have to go," I said quickly, my voice shaky. He didn't stop me. Instead, he gave me that same knowing smile, as if he had won some unspoken victory. "Next time," he said, his words a promise that hung heavy in the air. As I walked back to my car, my mind was reeling. I was torn between shame and exhilaration. I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I had chosen this, chose him, and now I had to live with it. And yet, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog, each step unsure, but my thoughts always leading me back to him. Every time I saw my husband, I couldn't shake the image of him, the neighbor, my lover. His smile, his touch, his voice, all swirling in my mind, drowning out the reality of my marriage. The guilt was unbearable, suffocating. It had become a constant companion, sitting heavy in my chest every time I looked at my husband. But then, there were moments when the desire would flash like a firestorm, and I would remember his kiss, his hands, the way I felt when he held me. That was the part that I couldn't let go of. The feeling of being alive again, of being wanted. I hadn't felt that in so long, not from my husband, not from anyone. I couldn't tell myself that I regretted it. Because I didn't. It happened again, almost by chance. Or perhaps it was fate, nudging us further down this dangerous path. I was walking out of the house, headed to the car, when I saw him again. This time he was standing at his front door, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He wasn't alone, but his gaze was so directed, so deliberate, that it felt like the entire world had vanished between us. He excused himself from whoever he had been talking to and came toward me, that same confident swagger in his steps. "Heading somewhere?" he asked, his voice low, almost a challenge. I felt my heart quicken. "Just out for a drive," I replied, my voice steady but betraying a hint of nerves. "You should come with me," he said suddenly, the words hanging between us. "I'm getting coffee. You've been avoiding me, and I don't think that's right." I opened my mouth to protest, but it died before I could form the words. I had been avoiding him, but it didn't feel right anymore. I didn't want to avoid him. I couldn't. I looked at him just for a second, then gave in, the decision made before I even fully realized it. "All right. A quick coffee." He smiled, and it was all I could do to keep my hands from trembling. The drive was silent, but the tension between us was thick, almost suffocating. The radio played softly in the background, but the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. When we arrived at the cafe, he parked the car, but he didn't immediately get out. Instead, he turned toward me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I know you've been struggling with this," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "I know you're married. I know what's at stake." I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him to stop, to tell him I couldn't do this, but the words died on my lips. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, his fingers brushing my hand on the center console. "I can feel it. You want this. You want me." My body responded before I could even think. I leaned toward him, drawn by that magnetic force, that pull I couldn't fight. "I don't know what I want," I whispered. He smiled again, a slow, knowing smile. "You do." Before I could respond, he closed the space between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was deep, urgent, and all-consuming. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. This was what I had wanted. This was what I had been searching for. The kiss broke, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The weight of our actions hung heavy in the air, but the pull between us was stronger than ever. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. I wasn't sure what he saw, but he didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he leaned in, his voice hushed. "We can't keep pretending like we don't want this, can we?" I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The answer was in the way my body responded to him, the way my heart raced when he touched me. He kissed me again, but this time there was no hesitation. There was no uncertainty. Just two people, bound by desire, by need, by the way we made each other feel alive. As we broke apart once more, I could feel the shift inside me. I was no longer just a wife, a mother, a woman trapped in a marriage that had lost its fire. I was someone else. Someone new. But at what cost? I didn't know yet. I didn't know if I cared. I couldn't escape the feeling. It lingered in my body, in my thoughts, in the spaces between my every breath. The kiss had awakened something in me that I hadn't realized was dormant for so long. There was no going back. I didn't want to go back. The days following the coffee felt like a blur. I went through the motions of my life, with my husband still oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me. His familiar affection, his constant presence only served to highlight the void that I felt. The absence of something real, something that made me feel alive. It wasn't just the physical desire that burned within me. It was the connection. The way he made me feel seen, not just as a wife or a mother, but as a woman with desires, with needs that were so much deeper than the routine I had settled into. That night, as my husband kissed me goodnight, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of resentment. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The way his touch felt too familiar, too safe, like the gentle pressure of his lips was a reminder of everything that I no longer craved. I kissed him back, but it felt distant, a chore, something that I had to do. The next day I couldn't get him out of my head. The neighbor, the lover, the man whose touch had branded me in a way I couldn't ignore. I tried to tell myself it was just an impulsive moment, but the truth was far more complicated. I needed to see him again. I needed to feel him. I found myself walking to his house that afternoon, my heart racing as I approached his front door. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this, but I couldn't stop myself. When he opened the door, there was no question in his eyes. He didn't ask what I was doing there or why I had come. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Come in," he said softly, stepping aside. I hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. I crossed the threshold into his home, and the world outside felt like it faded away. There was only the present, only him and the electricity between us. We sat together in his living room, the silence stretching between us, yet it didn't feel awkward. It felt comfortable, like a natural extension of the kiss we had shared. He turned to me, his eyes dark with intensity, yet there was something softer in the way he looked at me, a tenderness that both confused and enthralled me. "You want this, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I couldn't deny it. There was nothing left to hide. The tension that had been building inside me for days finally broke free. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Before I could say anything more, his hand reached for mine, his touch sending another wave of warmth through my body. He pulled me closer, and in that moment I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about the mess I was creating. I didn't care about anything but him. His lips were on mine again, and this time the kiss was different. It wasn't urgent or desperate, but it was full of promise, of things to come. I didn't hold back. I let myself feel everything. His hands on my body, the heat between us, the way he made me forget the world outside. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, but somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that I was crossing a line I would never be able to uncross. We spent the next few hours together, talking, laughing, and exploring the undeniable attraction between us. I was losing myself in him, in the feeling of being seen, of being wanted. But even as I reveled in the connection, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was slipping away. The weight of my actions, the guilt that hovered just out of reach, was starting to gnaw at me again. It wasn't just the affair. It was the realization that I was no longer the person I had been just a week ago. I was no longer just his wife, his lover, or even the woman I had been before this all started. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. But in that moment, I didn't want to be anyone else. As I left his house, I knew there was no turning back. The pull between us was stronger than anything I had felt in a long time, and I had become addicted to it. But I also knew that every choice I made from here on out would be consequential. My life as I knew it was changing. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for the storm that was about to follow. The days blurred together after that meeting. Each morning, I awoke with the weight of the choices I had made pressing down on me. I couldn't escape the feeling, the pull between two worlds. The one I had with my husband, steady and predictable, and the one that existed in the stolen moments with him. The guilt was constant. It gnawed at me every time I saw my husband smile, every time he touched me with that same familiarity that I once found comforting. But now it felt like a reminder of something that I could no longer reach. I couldn't ignore it, not anymore. The passion, the connection, it had awakened a part of me that had been dormant for so long. And now it was impossible to go back. I thought about him constantly. The way his hands had touched me, the way his lips had moved against mine. His presence haunted me. I tried to keep my distance, to push him from my mind, but every time I saw him the urge was stronger. His eyes locked onto mine in the hallway, in the yard, wherever we crossed paths. And each time that pull intensified. That afternoon I found myself standing in front of his door once again, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't meant to come. I didn't have a plan. But my feet had carried me here as though they knew what I needed before I did. He opened the door before I had a chance to knock, his gaze immediately softening when he saw me. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon," he said, his voice low, laced with something deeper than mere curiosity. I didn't know how to respond. Words felt useless when my body had already made its decision. Without a word I stepped inside. He didn't ask any questions. Neither of us spoke. We just knew. We didn't waste time with pleasantries. His hands were on me before I could even process what was happening. It felt natural, like this was exactly what I had been craving. I couldn't bring myself to feel guilty in that moment. It was like every touch, every kiss, wiped away the heaviness of the life I had been leading. There was no room for doubts, for regrets. Only the undeniable pull between us. His lips found my neck and I tilted my head back, giving him access as if I were willing to give him all of me. I was caught in the rush, in the hunger that had been simmering inside me for far too long. And for the first time I didn't think about my husband. I didn't think about the consequences. We spent hours together, talking and kissing, moving together with a familiarity that felt as though we had always belonged to each other. When he finally pulled back, there was a moment of silence between us. It was then that I realized just how far I had gone. This wasn't just about passion. This was about needing him, about wanting him in a way that was becoming impossible to ignore. "I don't want this to end," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. His hands cupped my face, his thumb brushing over my lips. "It doesn't have to," he said, his voice filled with promise. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. The temptation, the desire was now too much to resist. But as I stood there in his arms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something irreversible. When I left, I felt a familiar tug in my chest. I didn't know what the future held or how long this could continue, but I couldn't help but feel that I was losing myself in the process. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. But in that moment I didn't care. The weeks passed in a blur, each one blurring the lines between my two worlds. I was trapped between the person I used to be, the devoted wife, and the woman I was becoming, the one who felt seen, desired, alive. Each time I saw him, the pull only grew stronger, deeper. It was like I was walking a tightrope, teetering between the familiar safety of my marriage and the dangerous excitement that came with him. But now the weight of my choices was becoming undeniable. I could feel it in the way my husband touched me, so familiar, so comfortable, but it was all wrong. Felt like I was a stranger in my own life. I was betraying him, but at the same time I couldn't bring myself to stop. The guilt clawed at me every day, but every time I saw him I pushed it aside. When he kissed me I forgot everything. When he touched me it was like the world outside ceased to exist. One afternoon, after I had spent the morning pretending everything was fine at home, I found myself once again at his door. I hadn't planned it, but my feet had taken me there without a second thought. The moment he opened the door I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, the rush of excitement overtaking me. "You came back," he said with a grin, that familiar spark in his eyes. I didn't speak. Words didn't feel necessary anymore. He pulled me toward him, his hands on my waist, and before I could even process it, his lips were on mine. It was desperate this time, urgent, like we couldn't get enough of each other. I didn't think about what was right or wrong. I didn't care. His hands slid up under my shirt, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through my body. I responded instinctively, my fingers digging into his skin, pulling him closer, kneading him in a way that was impossible to explain. We moved to the couch and he sat down, pulling me onto his lap, his lips never leaving mine. My heart was racing, my body alive with anticipation. The guilt from earlier seemed miles away, replaced by the need for more for him. But as his hands roamed over my body, the thought of my husband flickered at the back of my mind. Was this worth it? The question didn't come from a place of clarity. It was a fleeting doubt, easily pushed aside by the intensity of what we were doing. This was my escape. This was my freedom. His fingers moved to unbutton my shirt and I couldn't stop him. I didn't want to. I wanted to feel him, completely. The moment felt like it stretched on forever. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my skin flushed. I looked at him, unsure of what to say. He didn't give me the chance to speak. Instead, he smiled and kissed me again, slower this time, savoring the moment. "Why do you fight this?" he murmured against my lips. "We both know what we want." I closed my eyes, my heart racing. He was right. I had known from the first moment our paths had crossed that this would happen. And now that it had, I couldn't stop it. But somewhere deep inside I knew I was paying a price. A price I hadn't fully understood yet. I left his house later that afternoon, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of something slipping away. My marriage. My identity. Myself. I didn't know how much longer I could keep living like this, caught between two lives, two desires. But in that moment, as I sat in my car, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back. It felt like I was walking a tightrope, each step teetering between the life I had and the life I was chasing. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I couldn't ignore the cracks that had begun to form, both in my marriage and in my own soul. The guilt gnawed at me, but it wasn't just the guilt anymore. It was the fear that I was losing something I couldn't get back. The fear that the love I once had for my husband was slipping through my fingers, irreparably damaged by my own choices. And then there was him. Every moment I spent with him pulled me further from the life I knew. It was a heady, intoxicating feeling, being desired, being wanted in a way that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the physicality of it, although that was undeniable. It was the way he made me feel alive. The way he looked at me with such intensity, with no expectations other than to enjoy the moment. But I knew the truth. Every stolen kiss, every whispered word came at a cost. I was breaking something fragile, something that had once been whole. I saw him again, of course. It was inevitable. I couldn't stay away. Started out like any other meeting, casual, simple. But this time there was something different. There was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension. I could feel it in the way he looked at me when I walked in. His eyes, dark and full of desire, didn't flicker with the same playful spark they had before. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I nodded, but I wasn't sure what I was nodding for. Everything was not okay. I stepped closer to him, needing the comfort of his touch, needing to feel something, anything that made sense in the chaos of my life. His hands found my waist again, and for a moment I let myself forget. But then the guilt came crashing back, heavy and suffocating. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered, pulling back. He didn't let me go far. His hand caught mine, pulling me back to him. "You're here because you want to be," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I know you want this." The words hit me hard. They were true. And that truth scared me. I pulled away from him completely, my heart racing. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I can't keep doing this." He watched me, his expression unreadable. For a moment there was silence between us. The silence of truth. "I've been thinking about us," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I'm breaking and I don't know what to do." He didn't answer right away. He just took a step back and studied me, his gaze softer now, understanding. "You don't have to do anything, not yet," he said quietly. "You don't have to make any decisions right now. Just be here. Just be with me for now." And in that moment it was almost enough. It was enough to let me forget. But only for a moment. As I left his house that afternoon, the weight of the decision pressed down on me again. I couldn't keep living like this. But I didn't know how to stop, how to return to the life I had. I was standing at a crossroads and I didn't know which path to choose. The life I had once known felt like it was slipping away, and the one I was chasing, the one with him, felt like it was built on sand. I could feel it shifting beneath me, crumbling slowly with every step I took. But I couldn't stop walking. The decision had been made, though I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Every moment leading up to it had been a blur of emotions: guilt, desire, longing, and now I stood on the precipice, staring down at the wreckage of everything I had built. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to admit that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But it was too late. The truth had been laid bare, and the consequences were inevitable. For weeks, I had been living in the tension between two worlds, caught between the comfort of my marriage and the undeniable pull of something else. Something dangerous. Something that made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. But now it was time to face what I had done. I walked into my house, my steps hesitant, my mind racing. My husband was sitting on the couch watching TV as if everything were normal. But nothing was normal. I was changed, and I wasn't sure I could hide it anymore. He looked up as I entered, offering a small, tired smile. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone light, casual. I couldn't answer. I couldn't lie to him anymore. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. He frowned, the smile fading. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The words wouldn't come easily. I've made a mistake," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I've been lying to you, and I can't keep doing this." He blinked, confusion and hurt flickering across his face. "What do you mean? What have you been lying about?" I hesitated. The truth felt heavy in my chest, suffocating me. I had spent so long pretending everything was fine, convincing myself that I could keep the pieces of my life together. But now it was clear. Everything was falling apart. "I've been seeing someone else," I whispered, barely able to breathe the words. The silence that followed was deafening. My husband's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't comprehend what I had just said. His eyes were wide, shocked, hurt. But there was no anger yet. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice a broken whisper. "I don't know," I replied, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I don't know what happened. It just happened." "I thought we were happy," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I thought we had something good." And the guilt hit me again, a sharp stab to my chest. I had broken him. I had shattered everything we had built. "We were," I said softly. "We were happy. But something inside me changed. I wasn't feeling alive anymore. And then I met him, and everything just changed. There was no excuse for what I had done. No justification. I had betrayed him. I had betrayed us." My husband stood up, his face unreadable now. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this," he said quietly, his voice full of pain. I wanted to reach out, to beg for his forgiveness, but I knew it was too late. The damage was done. He turned away from me then, walking toward the door. "I need some space," he said, his back to me. "I don't know what's next. But I can't do this right now." I watched him leave, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. He was right. There was no fixing this, no going back. I had destroyed everything, and now I had to face the consequences. I was alone, surrounded by the wreckage of my choices. And in that moment I realized that I had lost more than I had ever imagined.